Okay. So last week's writing assignment, everybody did pretty well. Keep focusing on using the headings. This one was a little bit different, of course. It had a little bit of a twist to it. Some things that I kind of saw consistent. Make sure that you understand the sections that you're working with, because for DUI there's two. I know it seems kind of weird. Why can't it just be one? But remember, the A section for California is the impairment, and then the B section is the .08, BAC and above. So it's like you can still be impaired, but not be .08. So you could actually still be charged with just the A section and not the B. So that is a possibility. Typically, for the most part, they go together, and if someone is A, they're probably going to be B, but not always. So those are just little things that you have to kind of understand. And then the other thing just to talk about briefly would be the passenger. So I had some interesting, a variety of thoughts on the passenger. Some of you let the passenger leave, which isn't a bad thing, but just remember, when somebody is under the influence or you suspect them to be, if you let them walk away, the question is later on, if they get in a car and drive, or they walk out in the middle of the street and get hit by a truck, are you responsible? So those are just little things to kind of keep in mind. If you wanted to, you could have released him to a responsible party. So somebody could come to the scene actually where you're at, or even to the station, and pick that person up. Or a couple of you actually hit on this. If the person is completely unable to care for themselves, meaning that they're so smashed that they can't walk, you get them out of the car, they stagger around. I mean, it's going to sound kind of cruddy, but go with me for a minute. You could actually take them into custody for a section called intoxication in public. So it's a 647 subsection F of the penal code, and it's basically intoxication in public. And there are a couple of cases, and I see your hand, Brandy, I'll get to you. There are a couple of cases that show that even sitting in a vehicle intoxicated can qualify. It's a little bit of a push, but it can qualify for intoxication in public. Go ahead.
I'm not naming any names, but would such charge keep someone from working in law enforcement or any part of that?
No, absolutely not. So no, and we've all done things, and you're looking at someone that's done some things. I just happened to not do so many things that I was fortunate enough to, be steered kind of away from some of those things I was doing when I was younger. And so I kind of got lucky. But yes, I mean, little things like that are no big deal. Will you get asked about it? Yes. Will they hassle you about it? Sure. But is it disqualifying? Absolutely not. So don't worry. I was one of the guys that was drinking a beer when I was 16 years old in my friend's car, and the police came up. And I know. So I wasn't the smartest kid. We were all kids. And well, compared to me, you're probably all kids, but yeah. So little things happen. So don't fret. But kind of back to our situation there, I just wanted you to be careful about releasing someone from the scene who you believe might be intoxicated, because you just don't want him to wander out in the middle of the street and get hit, or believe it or not, people have gotten in another vehicle and driven off and crashed. So you just want to kind of cover your rear end on that. So those are a couple things that I saw. And then to kind of give you some help, I picked out just a few just to look at. Stay with the headings. If you're not using the headings, you should be getting feedback from me that says, use them. Make sure that you're using the headings, and make sure that you're thorough in your heading. One big thing for the investigation on this thing is make sure that you're able to articulate your reason for the person being under the influence. A couple of you were a little bit light, where you basically contact the driver, you have a conversation, and as part of that conversation, you suspect he's under the influence. You need to articulate why. So whether you see bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, you smell alcohol, all of these little things that help you lead up to getting the person out of the car and going ahead with the tests. So again, so here's, one student's way of doing it. So that's not bad. And then, you're going to do the face sheet. One thing to remember, a couple of you, when you look at the sections on there, DUI is only a misdemeanor, unless, of course, you have prior convictions, then that changes things. A couple of you are, a lot of you did the reckless driving thing, which is totally fine too, because, spinning the tires, burning out. So you have the vehicle info, and then of course, if they did a blood test or a breath test, that's actually going to be booked as evidence. So that was one student's kind of look at it. Another student, same thing, observation, the investigation, kind of all the way through. A lot in the investigation here, which is fine. So quite a bit, but a lot of objective symptoms were noted in this student's symptoms, so that's good. When you do the tests, make sure that you spell them out. Don't just say I did I did 3 tests and then list the tests. The reason that you write these out is because it explains it when you go to court, and you may not be called upon to have to explain it again. And if you can't remember it by memory, you have a report to actually read on the stand if you need to tell somebody what happened. So that's why you want to actually state what the tests were. So it's important that you kind of remember that. And then the last one, just to kind of look at it. Let's see, all right. Same thing, remember all the face pages. If you do a blood kit, you're going to need that. This student actually did a traffic citation, which is kind of cool. So you would cite this person out. They could go to county, to the county jail, but they'll get cited out. Misdemeanors typically don't stay in custody. If you decided to do the worksheet, that's great. And here's one that someone did, and they marked the little X's there for the feet and all that. This person actually did a 180 and a booking slip, so this is pretty cool. But I wanted to get to the headings. Same thing. If you really stick to the headings, it's really going to help you out. And then, when you talk about your investigation, should talk about what you saw, smelled, heard, whatever that led you to believe that this person was under the influence. And I'm pretty sure that, so this, a couple of you actually stuck to the script on there where they had a traffic officer come out, which is totally fine. Smaller agencies may not have that, so you might be the traffic person, so you may have to do that. Here, there was a supplemental report done by the other officer, so that's cool. But again, spell out those tests. So that way, if you have to testify in court, you've got all of this information at your disposal, and you don't have to rethink everything. So those are pretty important things to remember. Okay, for this week, and then we're going to jump into our lecture. Any questions on the DUI from last week? Anything that stands out that you just kind of don't understand, or you just want me to hurry so you can go watch your favorite TV show or whatever? All right, so let's go. So this week's assignment is, as we talked about it's going to be a follow-up, right? Okay, so we have the 2 detectives, and it's going to be a supplemental report. And the big issue in this one is the Miranda issue. So I actually showed, this is what a Miranda card looks like if you've never seen one. I even gave you a link to, there's a website that gives you a little bit more of the elements of Miranda if you don't quite get it. So there's that. I gave you the 2 sections that are applicable for this case. And I think that was it. Okay. So, and basically the issue is the detectives want to talk to this person. They're not really sure if she's going to talk to them. So they go out there, and I agree with the statement made earlier. It's not the best demo video, but it is good, and it's enough to kind of get you thinking on whether or not they did things properly. But is there a kind of a Miranda thing? And so just kind of think about that as you're putting this one together for this week. So I think that's it. Any questions I can kind of talk about on this one before we move on to our lecture for tonight? You guys are easy.
I have a question about the homicide report.
Okay.
In the description, you said that there's a starting point video. Were you talking about this video, or because I don't see any other video?
There should only be one video in the homicide assignment. Is it there?
I didn't see one. I thought you probably were referring to the writing assignment, if possible, because I mean that's the only one I've seen. And I'm looking at it right now, and I still can't see nothing.
It's in the first week, I think. That's where you put it up there.
Oh, so it's not in like the description. I would have to go to the module.
It's like one of the first announcements or something like that in there.
So let's
Thank you.
Let me make
Wait, because when I go through the module, I can see the video too.
All right.
I just pulled it up.
Let me make sure. This is good. So here, it should be under here, right? You should be finding it under your final report. So it should be under this first one here. And if I didn't post it, then shame on me. I hope it's there. And then when you go, there it is. It might take a second to load, but I'm seeing it.
That's what I see as well.
Okay.
Maybe it's because I'm on my phone, because the only one I see is the student assignment submission video, the tutorial, but I don't see that one.
Okay. So it will be under the actual, that whole separate section for your final writing project. So it's
on your phone. Try to update your YouTube app. I'm sorry, Professor. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's
I had to do that.
Okay.
The video wouldn't work for me either.
Okay, I'll try looking on my computer as well, just in case.
And if anyone has a hard time finding it or viewing it, let me know, and I'll just send a link to it if I need to. But yeah, it should be under this first link right here. So I'm seeing it, so I'm hoping that the rest of you can as well. And then finally, before we jump into the lecture, if you are behind, remember I sent out a couple emails to those that didn't quite have time or couldn't get their assignments in, whatever. I'm trying to say that nicely, but that might need some help. And if you're able to get those into me before the break, which is the end of this week that we're in right now, which is what, I think the 28th? Is that Sunday? Yeah, so Sunday night at 11, I will grade them, okay? And I'll give you some points for them. So it'd be nice to kind of get cleaned up by break time. So that would be good. So I'm offering that as kind of a freebie. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our Chapter 8 lecture for tonight. Here we go. All right, so Chapter 8 is going to, cover statements, and it kind of fits right in with your writing assignment for this week, because you are going to be, per the video, talking to someone, a potential suspect. Actually, when I watched the video, I'm pretty sure they believe that this person is guilty, or involved as a suspect. And what I'm hoping that you kind of take out of this is to understand the difference between a reporting party, a victim, a witness, and a suspect, because that is going to take a different level of interview technique. You're not going to talk to a victim the same way that you might interrogate a suspect or a witness or something like that. And then sometimes, remember, the reporting party may just be the person that reports. maybe they heard something and they're calling it in, but they didn't see anything. They're not a victim. They're not really a witness to, visually, they just heard something, so they called it in. So, and a reporting party could be a witness. So, sometimes these kind of overlap. And with that is, the ability to be able to understand the importance of identifying each one of those folks when you get to a scene. And who do you interview first? And, we've already talked about making sure that your scene is safe. Making sure that, and we've gone over this before, the importance of taking your notes, being able to translate your interview notes into your report. So making sure that you write clear enough to where you can actually read your own writing, because that's important. That was always a problem for me. I really never had good handwriting. And back in the olden days, we didn't have a lot of computers and things like that. So when I first started, you had to handwrite everything, and it was a lot more difficult. So, reading your own writing is good. And then, understand how to clarify what an interview is telling you during an interview, and how you may need to ask follow-up questions. Don't just take everything that someone says as, hey, this is it. What they said is perfect. If you need to clarify something, or you're not sure, it's not rude to ask someone, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Or I didn't get all of that. Would you mind repeating that? And that helps them stay on track as well. So those are important. So one thing I believe, especially where we're at right now, about halfway through this textbook, there's a lot of writing, and you're starting to see that as we start to do larger writing assignments. It's not that simple. In the aspect is there's a lot of writing. So law enforcement, we spend a lot of time writing, but we also spend a lot of time talking to people, whether they're witnesses, victims, suspects. Part of your job is to be able to differentiate between those individuals and to apply whatever tactic you're going to apply when you talk to them. And remember, at the end of the day, okay, you're going to be better off being nice, because being rude never gets you anywhere. Okay, so that's just kind of my 2 cents right there. A lot of these interviews can be time consuming, they can be challenging, and they can be daunting, because there are those folks that just won't admit. And you could have all the evidence in the world, and you're looking to try to get them to admit to something, and they just won't do it. And it can be kind of frustrating. So, just kind of understand that. But we're going to kind of look at some basic interview guidelines that hopefully can help simplify things. One of the biggest things to know is, who are these people? So we've kind of looked at it from a couple of other, earlier in some chapters when we talked about interviewing. Remember, the victim is the person that's either injured by the crime or who the crime is committed against. That typically is your victim. The complainant can be the person who wants something done. Sometimes they call it we call it an RP for short, reporting party. And sometimes these folks can be, all the same. And a witness is a person who saw the crime or part of it, but maybe the crime was not committed against them. So we at least need to understand who these people are. And then we'll talk about the suspect later on. So again, the reporting party is the person who contacted law enforcement to report a crime or some other situation that they believe needs the involvement of law enforcement. Typically, it's going to be a witness, but it's not always. Sometimes they're kind of separated there. And even on your reports, when you look at different forms, and again, understand that different departments have different forms. You've seen a lot of San Bernardino County and also Riverside County. So we're trying to give you kind of a look between the two counties. But you'll even see on the report forms, you'll see victim, reporting party, witness, or other, because sometimes, there's a separate witness, there's a separate RP, and there's a separate victim. And then there's a suspect, of course. But even the report forms reflect the fact that they're not always the same. The victim, like I said, is the person who has been wronged in a criminal manner by another. So they've been victimized by somebody. And the wrong that we're talking about is defined typically as a crime by statutory law. And just quickly, and if you've been in my criminal law class, you know this, but when I talk about statutory law, what do I mean? Nobody?
Your rights?
Not necessarily. Good try though. California only has statutory law. So statutory law basically means written law. So kind of like statute. So that's where statutory come from. So we don't have any, kind of presumed law. So basically, if it's not written, if it's not in there, it may not be a criminal law, because all of our laws are statutory law, which means that they're written in the penal code or the health and safety code or the vehicle code or some other type of criminal code. And that statutory law stipulates the elements of a crime. So when we go back to your DUI, incident, you had to be able to basically meet the elements of DUI. And if you couldn't meet those elements, then you really couldn't charge for that particular offense. And all statutory elements have to be present to arrest and charge a person for a particular crime. So when you write your reports, it's important to know, your statutory law, because all of those elements have to be there, all right, in order to really make an arrest and to charge a person. So if we look at robbery, which is an easy one to look at. So if we look at, it's Penal Code 211, and the kind of the bold writing or bold text shows you what you have to prove basically in your report. So if you're going to make an arrest for robbery, you have to have what they call the felonious taking, personal property in the possession of another from their person or immediate presence against their will by force or fear. If you don't meet all of those elements, you're not going to have a robbery. And from state to state, the elements might be a little bit different, but typically they're somewhat the same. But so when you're writing your report for your arrest for robbery, you have to think, do I have all of these elements in there? And if I don't, I'm going to have to either interview a suspect, a witness, a victim in order to get that. Meaning, like, was the property taken from their person? You're going to have to establish that. Were they afraid? Was there force or fear against their will? All this stuff like that. So same thing with burglary. If we look at that, if we go back to the burglary arrests that you made, every person who enters any house, and then there's a bunch of different things, so I didn't list them all, but then you go down further, it talks about right here, with the intent to commit grand theft or petty larceny or any felony. So if we go back to our burglary where the guy broke into the bar, you have to show that his intention was to go in and commit some type of theft or felony. And if you think about it, how did you show that? If we look back on our 459 arrest, what was one thing that you were able to do to show that person's intent to commit a theft?
You moved property.
He moved the property. So there you go. Now, and you add it up with some other things, and you're going to be able to show that his intent was, otherwise, if he really just came in to get out of the cold, he wouldn't have moved any of that property. So that is part of writing a good report, is being able to establish through the interview process from your victim, your witness, even your suspect, all of the different elements. And then once you do that, then you're on solid ground. If you don't meet all those elements, then you may not have that crime, or certainly you may not be able to arrest for it. So kind of staying with victim and witnesses, when you interview a victim or a witness, give the person a chance to kind of explain what happened. so you can determine what type of crime. Don't focus in so hard right away. I mean, sometimes I've heard a lot of officers, they may just kind of go, tell me what happened, just kind of, and they leave it like that, and the person starts talking, and then you can think of questions you want to ask. But because you want them to get out some of that information, so you really want to figure out what crime happened. Make sure you develop a rapport with these folks before you try to record any information. And remember, some of them are going to be probably a little pissed off or upset or emotional because they got their, car broken into, or their purse stolen, or their wallet stolen, or whatever, or their home got burglarized. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever had that happen, it's really shitty. And you feel kind of a little afraid, and someone was in your house, and there's so many things going on. So you really have to kind of understand they're not having their best day. So that's why you need to be a little bit more, understanding and empathetic towards what they're going through. Not just, hey, can I have your ID? Write down some stuff and say, okay, anything taken, and then okay, see you later. Here's the card with your report number on it. That's not what you want to do. Prior to your interview process, make sure that, again, we've talked about this, that your scene is safe, and you do what you can to make the victim feel safe and comfortable. So if it's a burglary, and you're pretty sure that no one's in the house, because the door's been open and property is, maybe on the front lawn because they dropped some stuff or a witness saw them leave, wouldn't it be a good idea to actually walk through the house? Go through the entire house just to make sure, so the person that's there, the victim, knows that you went through the house and you looked in the closets and you looked under the bed and you looked in all the different rooms to make sure, you're double checking the scene, but you're also making them feel at ease because you've checked the premise, if that makes any sense. And then once that's secure and that person is feeling, the best they can, then you can go ahead and start the interview. And always keep in mind, it's a great idea to separate your victims, your witnesses, and your suspects, because you don't want them to talk. Any ideas why? Why do we separate people? Besides the fact you don't want them to talk.
So that they would not be able to plan what they're going to tell the police, or it's not scripted. It's not going to be scripted.
Yeah, so if they're suspects, you separate them because you don't want them to get their stories together. So that's true, unless you're going to do it on purpose. So if you have two suspects and we've done this before, where you can take a tape recorder and you put it in the back seat of a police car, or even if you leave it on the front seat, if you put the suspects in the back seat, is there any right to privacy in the back seat of my police car after you've been arrested? So a couple, I don't hear a lot, but
It's a police car, I think.
Yeah, there's no right to privacy. So Alec, I saw you shaking your head. No, there isn't. So if they start talking to each other, we just let them talk, and we'll leave them alone, because what they're talking about is, hey, don't tell them this. Hey, don't tell them that. And then when it's all said and done, we can use that recording. So that's a good thing. So that would be for suspects. But, the best way, unless you plan to do that, is to separate them so they don't have a chance to get their stories together. For victims, it's kind of the same thing, where they don't start agreeing with each other. Where one says, hey, I saw the car. It looked kind of dark green. What do you think? Well, I don't know. I thought it was, more brown. Yeah, you might be right. It's brown. And then they start agreeing, and then you're not getting a really good statement, because they're starting to agree with each other. Same with witnesses. So it is good to separate them if you can. Any questions on that? It might seem kind of like a minor detail, but it is important that we do that. So begin your interview, especially when you're talking about victims and witnesses, etc. Don't be threatening. Don't be mean. Be as polite as possible. as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of officers ask an open-ended question like, "Hey, why don't you tell me what happened?" It gives the person a chance to vent a little bit, and then you can start writing down questions to kind of follow up. But that's not a bad thing to really start with what happened, and then that'll get the communication process kind of flowing between everybody. You don't want to let them ramble too long. I mean, if they just keep going on and on and on, at some point you're going to have to stop them and maybe focus them back. But just to get the conversation kind of going, it's not a bad thing. During your initial interview, be a good listener. And guys, sorry, we're not as good as that with that aspect. Sorry, guys just don't listen as well as ladies do. And I'm trying not to be mean about that, but we typically don't. We're more impatient and we're less empathetic. And that's just the way it is. So, understand, be a good listener, hear what they have to say, use a lot of your, note your nonverbal skills to keep the interview going. Don't, when you're interviewing somebody, I know maybe you can't see me, don't do this when you're interviewing somebody, or Zena, I see you, and that's fine for class, but for interviewing, you want to be like, kind of like that, because it kind of looks like you're just kicking back or maybe not interested. And, and here's another thing, even if maybe they're not right, don't roll your eyes or make that sound that your kids make, like, that kind of thing. And you all know what I'm talking about. So you have to be careful and don't laugh. Okay, if they say something that is really kind of out there or odd or whatever, and they're a witness or a victim, don't laugh, because maybe they're really serious, and it really isn't. You don't want to make them feel like they're not valuable or important. Typically, this would be when they're talking is when you would want to take some notes. Look up every once in a while when you're taking notes. I know sometimes that might be difficult, and but you don't want to just be staring down at your paper, writing the whole time and never looking back up, because what'll happen is the victim will just kind of keep on talking and talking, and it's harder for you to redirect them. So that's an important thing to do, is to make some eye contact. When it comes to recording or documentation, again, if you don't have anything clear, and you can tape record victims and you can tape record witnesses, it's not a bad thing to do. A lot of agencies do it. If you don't have the whole story or you're not sure, ask them to repeat it. You're not going to they're not going to think anything less of you if you ask them to repeat something. So, and again, having them repeat something keeps them kind of focused and kind of straightforward. If you're going to interview a victim or a witness, you don't have to crowd them into the corner in an interview room. You can offer them something like, coffee or whatever you have if they're thirsty or whatever. You're not, because they're victims and witnesses or whatever, a blanket sometimes they might need. These are all things that you can do. But you don't have to kind of crowd them in a little bit, as much as a strategy that you might use for a suspect. So just kind of understand that. And then again, your final stage, you can ask the clarifying questions, but focus on specific questions. If they didn't hit something, go back to it and then ask them to clarify it. And then when you're done, of course, you're going to thank them for their time, offer them some type of assistance if you have it. If somebody's door got kicked open or something like that, you may be able to call out your public works department to temporarily fix the door, or kind of bolt it shut, or something like that, or get a neighbor to help or something. Don't just leave without offering some type of assistance. You really can't do too much, but you can help people out, so they don't feel like you just kind of took some information and then and left. Let's see, what else do we have? Let's see, we already talked about that. your textbook has some sample notes for crime reports, but you guys have kind of gotten pretty good. Just understand, some of the interviews you may want to pre-write your questions. It's not a bad thing if it's a really important interview. Then you may want to actually kind of, before you go into the interview, write out the questions that you want to ask the suspect. It's a little less important with victims or witnesses, but sometimes that'll kind of help you. Again, we talked about notes. Make sure that you're accurate with name spelling, date of birth, addresses, and phone numbers, most importantly. Because if you're going to issue a subpoena or the court's going to mail them something or what have you, you're going to want to get all that information correct. Let's see. All right, so they have a couple of examples. I'm not going to play these just for time's sake, but we know when we're interviewing suspects that we don't use coercion. So if you've never seen a picture of waterboarding, we don't do this. And there's a couple of videos that go with that one, or with this one, if you've ever seen. I think this is Taken 2? Maybe 3. Anyway, some of my favorite movies. But just understand that coercion, when it comes to suspects, you really want to be careful with that. Okay? So when you're interviewing or interrogating, which typically you're going to be interrogating more on the, for potential suspects, you want to be non-threatening. Okay, there's a time and a place to be a little bit more direct. I'm not going to use the word mean, but I'll use the word direct, where you may be a little more abrupt or maybe even change the tone in your voice a bit. But initially, you want to start off with being professional and non-threatening. And then based on, what the person kind of does or says, you can kind of move on from there. So just kind of understand that. When you're asking questions, understand the different types of questions. And we'll go through each one of these quickly individually, because there's a reason for each type of question. All right, so we're going to talk briefly about direct, indirect, closed, open-ended, and then a leading question. So we'll kind of look at that. So direct questions are to the point. Very little possibility for someone to mistake what you said or for you to misinterpret what they said. A direct question would be something like, what time did you leave for wherever? That's pretty direct, because you're going to get a very simple response. It's going to be 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or whatever they tell you. That's a direct question. You're not leaving it open for interpretation for the most part. An indirect might be a little bit more polite, okay? And it's meant to kind of elicit a little bit more information or a variety of information. So that might be kind of like, how do you and your neighbor get along? And instead, and the person might say, well, we get along good, but a lot of times they'll say a little bit more. So that's kind of an indirect question. So if you want to basically elicit a little bit more. Closed-ended is pretty much yes or no, or super short. Did you go straight home after work? Yes, no. So that would be more of a closed thing. Do you get along with your neighbor? Yes, no. Open-ended is kind of the opposite, where you're going to elicit a lot more information. So the example here is, what can you tell me about, your relationship with your neighbor? How'd you guys get along? And that person will tell you a little bit more. So it's meant to really get into the insight of how somebody might feel about another individual. So it's a little bit more of a detailed. And then the leading question, you want to stay away from this. And this happens in court a lot of times under testimony. But it's basically a question that prompts somebody to give an answer. So the example I kind of say, give here, was the suspect wearing a black jacket? Well, I already told you the color of the jacket. So chances are you're probably going to say, yeah, I think they were. So you don't want to do that. A better way to do that is, what color, was the you can ask, What was the suspect wearing a jacket or what, what clothing, what color? So break that up into a couple of different questions. Kind of staying with the interviewing, you're going to have an opportunity to interview suspects involved in crimes. It's important to remember that there's a difference, again, between interviews and interrogations. And interestingly enough, an interview can turn into an interrogation. So this week's assignment is a little bit interesting in the fact that the detectives that go out, they already know or believe this person is a suspect, but they're trying to plan it to where the person will talk to them. And then after they start to talk to her, they get a little bit of information, and then they end up arresting her. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how you guys deal with that. Interview, remember again, especially when you're talking about suspects, an individual is free to leave if they choose. Interviews are typically with victims or witnesses, not all the time. An interrogation, typically the person is not free to leave, and they're usually with suspects. Keep in mind with Miranda, typically there's two things that have to be present, and I think I'll get to that in a minute. Kind of staying along with the interviewing, when you get incriminating information, if you're interviewing somebody, you should stop the interview, and at that point you may want to advise them of their Miranda rights if it's incriminating. Okay, you want to determine when to provide Miranda. It's kind of important that you kind of understand that. We use, when we read, and you will as a law enforcement officer, typically there's two ways to give somebody Miranda. It's via a card, which I showed you before, like a little Miranda card, or what we have as a form. So it kind of looks like this. This is a Miranda card. And remember, these two things have to be present. Otherwise, you typically, by case law, if one of these are missing, you don't have to Mirandize somebody. You can, but remember, you run the risk of them saying, I don't want to talk to you. So just understand that. But this is the Miranda card. You've probably heard it on TV before when people say, kind of, they've read it before. So you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to talk to an attorney and have him or her present with you while you're being questioned. If you cannot afford to hire an attorney, one will be appointed to represent you if you wish, and it's free of charge. You can decide at any time to exercise these rights and not answer any questions. People may want to talk to you at first, and then as you start to talk to them more, they may say, no, I don't want to talk anymore. So they can do that. And then the bottom part of the waiver is important. Do you understand these rights? Each of them. Because if they don't, you want to be able to explain it so they understand. And then number two, having these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to us now? So that's a lot to memorize. And the reason for the card, which I believe I've kind of talked about before, is if you go to court and you testify that you have advised someone of their Miranda rights, the defense attorney might do something interesting like, well, what are those rights, officer? And if you have to recall it from memory, you might mess up. So in your report, a lot of times I would say, I advised suspect Jones of his Miranda rights per a pre-printed Miranda card. Here's the card. So when I go to court, the attorney can say, did you advise them of his rights? Yes, I did, per a card. Well, what are those? And I could pull that card out and I could read it right off the card, because that's how typically I would do business. So that's one way. The other way is what we call a Miranda warning form. So it kind of looks like this. This is a generic one, but it has the information here, the same on the card, but you have the person sign it. And then you have a witnessing officer sign it. So that way they understand. And then here it talks about if the person decides to waive their rights, they would, we would date and time that as well, meaning that they're willing to talk to us. So having it in writing isn't a bad thing to be able to bring to court, put with your report, if in fact they say, well, the officer, didn't read me my rights. Well, I have this form right here. but always make sure you're doing it on video or at least audio, so that way they can't turn the tables on you in court. Your textbook has a couple of forms, but they all pretty much look the same. Again, with suspects, the same interview principles apply to suspects as to victims as far as questioning, etc. One major difference in interviewing a suspect is that, you always interview a suspect from a position of safety. So if you have a homicide suspect, in an interview room, should you have them handcuffed or not? What do you guys think?
No.
Okay. Anybody else?
I say it depends. Maybe he's so violent and then
Okay.
you want to cover.
Yeah, you have to be careful. And the court's not going to frown on it too much if, you have them handcuffed. A lot of the interview rooms might have a little bar on the table where you can handcuff one of their wrists to that little bar so the person can't stand up and, come after you or something like that. So that's, do you want to have them sitting in the corner with their hands behind their back handcuffed? Probably not, but you still want to make sure that you're in a safe position. And if you've seen interview rooms, there's usually not a lot of stuff in there that people can pick up or throw or hit you with. There's a couple of chairs and a table, and you bring in your pad of paper or what have you. So there's not always a lot in there, but you want to be safe about it. Remember, with Miranda, there's a couple of critical elements. First, again, make sure you read it correctly. Was it properly given? And are they willing to give a statement after they understand it? And if they say, no, I want an attorney, that means no, they want an attorney. So don't keep harping on them. Don't try to, get ahead of the game and try to get a statement out of them. If they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk. And it'll be okay. Same with suspects, though. Sometimes an effective way to establish rapport is you can downplay the crime a little bit. And I know it sounds kind of crummy, but if you're willing to kind of say, yeah, I understand why you may have done that, and then kind of ask, and if they're willing to talk to you, you're kind of downplaying it a little bit. That's one way to kind of get someone to talk to you. Watch your body language. Try not to be judgmental. If you can help it, it's really tough when you're sitting across from an individual that maybe has molested 5 little kids and you're trying to interview them. It's difficult not to be pissy about it or want to headbutt them or whatever your thing is, but you have to understand your job here is to get your case filed, and you don't want to be judgmental. You want them to be comfortable and talkative, and you want to do the best for your case, because ultimately the victim is going to benefit from that. Be aware of their body language when you're dealing with a suspect. Sometimes victims, but typically suspects. Different movements that they make, little nervous habits that they might have, little gestures, a lot of times facial expressions. You can kind of tell, even if they're sweating or breathing heavy, or messing with their fingers. Those are all things to look at. Eye contact, almost always, not 100%, but if they don't look at you, chances are they're not really telling the whole truth. So eye contact is one of those biggies. If they start to look down, people feel guilty when they look down, or they're trying to avoid. So just understand that. And same with tone of voice. Is their voice getting higher? Are they getting more amped up? Do you need to kind of slow things down a little bit? But just, body language, when you look at the picture right here, here's a clear picture of somebody that doesn't want to talk to you. Got their arms crossed, looking away. So that's a perfect thing of someone that is not interested in listening to you. So just, watch their hands, again, for safety. If they start doing this and they start kind of grinding their hands up a little bit, that could be either nerves or it could be they're trying to get, some guts together because they're going to maybe take a swing at you. So just, look at those little things as you're doing the different interviews. Listen carefully to everything they tell you. Your focus should be on, their statements and the nonverbal demeanor, kind of both, but be a good listener. Don't interrupt them every 5 seconds and try to clarify things every 5 seconds, because you want them to give you a statement and then you'll ask clarifying questions and maybe you can catch them in a lie. So, let them talk and then try to clear things up as you go through. So be a listener for the most part. Be in control of the interrogation. Don't let the suspect be in control. If you feel like the person is a little too violent to interview, don't interview them right away. Let them sit for a few minutes and let them kind of chill out. You may want to find out what the suspect might be afraid of. And it's not, and you can exploit their weakness. Typically for gang shootings, this is always a good one, to kind of find out what's going on. And then same with, whether it's a witness, a victim, a suspect, once you have everything that you want, then you can be done and conclude the interview. These are interviews that you definitely want to videotape so you can look at body language, and at the very minimal audio tape. But if it's a big case, you're going to want to videotape it so you can get their facial expressions, etc. So it's always important. Make sure that if you have something important, just like we've talked about before, if there's an important direct quote regarding the crime, make sure you get that, or any other type of incriminating statement. Something like, well, I was there, Farrar, but I didn't do it. That should be a direct quote, because what is that suspect telling you? That he was there, so you put him at the crime scene. Even though he denies doing it, but that's a good thing. Any admissions of guilt, any waiver for medical attention, a lot of those things are things that are important to quote. And then some departments actually have the person write a statement out. We've done that before on larger cases, and it's not a bad thing to do, or you don't have to. But these are things that are just at your disposal if you want to have somebody write out a statement, if they're willing to talk to you and willing to write that statement out. So again, just some tips for gathering statements. Make sure you're in that position of safety. Separate your witnesses quickly. It really is important to do that. Always attempt to develop a rapport with a person prior to documenting any information, and that's a victim, witness, suspect, etc. Ask those open-ended questions. So be a good listener. Let them tell you things, and then you can kind of come back around and lock them into something. So let them tell you stuff. Don't be so, focused to where you're not going to listen to what they're going to say. Again, don't forget to clarify. If there's something that you don't understand or something that you want to clarify, that's totally okay to do with anyone, with a witness, a victim, or suspect. Listen well. Observe all that nonverbal communication. And if it's on video, again, it's even better. And if you want, and it's important enough, or kind of a large crime, or a heavy, maybe a homicide or something, if they're willing to, have them write out a statement. That's not a bad thing. And then you can still ask questions even though they write out a statement. But having them do that isn't a bad thing. Okay. So with that said, I wanted to just kind of hit one more thing from the investigation side, and we'll kind of wrap things up. And we've talked about this again. We already know this is from a criminal investigation course, but I want to make sure that we looked at the report writing side, but now we're going to look at the kind of investigative side. So we've already gone through that. We know who the victims are. We know what a complainant is. We know what a witness is. But, understand that some information is going to be volunteered and some you're going to have to work for. So we've talked about what an interview is, typically non-suspect, typically, where an interrogation is more, more towards somebody that might be a suspect. If you want to know what some good characteristics are for investigators, be adaptable, be culturally adroit, which means skillful, understand that people are different, and what works for one person may not work for another. So try to understand some of those differences. And an example of that is when I worked in Compton, we had a kind of a pocket, if you will, a neighborhood that was Pacific Islander, Samoan. And they have kind of rules in the neighborhood. And basically, if you would go into this particular area to maybe make an arrest or talk to someone, you would always go to the kind of the leader's house, that gentleman that was known as kind of like the neighborhood leader. And you would go to that person and explain a little bit about what you're doing, and then they would let you go. And you didn't have to do that, but you understood that there was kind of a little cultural process there. And it just made things a lot easier going into that neighborhood to make an arrest. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Be self-controlled. You really need to be under control, and you need to be patient. And that was always one of my harder things. I'm not always the most patient individual. So a good interviewer is going to be patient because it's going to take time. Be confident in your abilities. So, always be optimistic, but kind of portray that confidence. That's important. Be objective. Does anybody know what I mean by that? What's it mean to be objective? I'll take a drink.
To give them the benefit of the doubt.
It's like you're not blatantly like taking one side or the other, right?
Right. So being objective is not necessarily giving someone the benefit of the doubt. I heard that. I mean, sort of, but it's you're not taking sides. Someone's not guilty just because you're interviewing them or what have you. So you just want to understand that you want to be objective. So that's always that's an important thing. You want to be sensitive to somebody's rights. So and now more than ever in law enforcement, we want to understand and do things the right way. So we really do want to be sensitive to an individual's rights. You want to be knowledgeable about the elements of the crime. We talked about the importance of knowing the elements. Well, if you don't know them, it's going to be really hard to interview because you won't know the right questions to ask and who to ask them of. So understand the elements of what you're going to interview somebody for. That's really an important thing. Successful questioning or interviewing requires two-way communication. So it's going to be you speaking to the other person. And, I kind of asked a question, what are some ways that you might prepare, or do prior to or during an interview to make somebody be, a little bit more willing to communicate? And it could be just offering, again, a blanket, something to drink, being a little bit more patient, more empathetic. Really, what I want you to do, more importantly, is to understand reasons people don't want to talk to you. Because not everybody, you can be a really good interviewer, but not everybody's going to want to talk to you. And some of the reasons that are listed here might not seem logical to you, but you have to understand there really are barriers with folks. And, again, depending upon the crime, when I worked in Compton, a lot of gang shootings, not everybody liked to talk to the police. So you had to develop a rapport with the different gang members, etc., in order to get them to talk to you. And some barriers can be people don't want to be a snitch or labeled a snitch. They might believe there's some type of prejudice. They might actually be afraid to talk to you for fear of retaliation or something similar. There could be a language issue where people just they don't want to talk to law enforcement because there's a language issue, or even hearing impaired. So there's all these different barriers for you to kind of think about. But just understand that there are barriers out there, and that'll make you a lot more effective. I talked before about listening and observing. This is really important when you pick up on body language, nonverbal clues when you're interviewing somebody. I used to put a paper clip on the table. There'd be nothing on the table. I would have a pad of paper, and I would offer someone, water or whatever, and I'd put a paper clip on the table, and in about 1 minute, they'd pick it up and start twisting it around. So you could tell that they're nervous. And if they kind of left it alone, then they really weren't quite as nervous. We talked about the different types of questioning, so I'm not going to go into all those again, but just remember there are different techniques. From what you've seen on TV, the good cop, bad cop, that doesn't really happen as much as you think. But if you're effective as an investigator, you really don't need to play that game, but just know the different types of questioning. And we've already kind of gone through those, so I'm going to get through those so we don't spend too much time. Watch the leading questions, though. And then kind of finishing up with kind of, a really important part would be, the Miranda, and talking about recording and videotaping interviews. A lot of agencies, they have policies on digital video or audio recordings for witnesses, victims, suspects. A lot of times it's in your policy, but anytime you have a big case, you definitely want to get that individual into a controlled environment, like at your police department, in an interview room that has audio and video, both, so you can pick up on a lot of those clues and then understand when Miranda comes into play. And, a couple of photos of different things. A lot of times when someone's being interviewed in the upper left, you'll have somebody kind of taking notes for you. Most interview rooms have cameras. And sometimes they're hidden, so they're more surreptitious, and sometimes they're just like this one here, where it's pretty obvious there's a camera in there. We have body cameras now too, but sometimes again there's hidden cameras. Most suspects are probably pretty astute if they've been in the system at all, that they more than likely know there's a camera in the room, but not always. And there's no law that says that you have to tell them that there's a camera in there. So that's important. So I talked about the way interview rooms look. They're not super classy, if you will. There's not a lot of hoopla in here. It's a table, a couple of chairs. You can see down in the corner down here, there's some leg cuffs. So here they can have the suspect sit here, and they can secure them at least to the table. And this is actually kind of cemented into the ground. So, different interview rooms have different setups, but there's not a lot in there. And there's a reason for that, because we don't want a lot of things to go flying around if by chance that would happen. So we don't want the officer to get injured. We don't want the suspect to get injured. So they're very kind of bare, if you will. I talked a little bit about some security things. So here's an example of a table where someone can be handcuffed to the table for security purposes. So that way their hands aren't behind their back the whole time. So this makes them feel a little bit more comfortable, and maybe they're more willing to talk to you. So a couple of examples. And then here's an interview room that's big enough for two. And typically that's how they are. They're not very big. All right, we already talked a lot about, the interview itself. We talked about separating witnesses, so we can kind of go through that. A little bit about advanced planning. Review the reports. So if you're doing a supplemental report or a follow-up, or you make an arrest on somebody else's case, you want to look at the reports before you do the interview. You want to be able to know the questions that you want answers to before you do that. You don't want to try to make it up on the fly. It's really difficult to do that. So you want to be able to anticipate how people might answer the question and maybe ask a follow-up question. So again, good investigators will set up their interviews and have a lot of their questions already pre-written out. So that's important to remember. Be friendly. I talked about that. This is more kind of for the field. Make sure that you have ID if you're in plain clothes. And let's see, we talked about establishing rapport, so we don't have to really go through that too much. Remember, you're going to have reluctant witnesses, those that really may not want to talk to you. And you may not be able to talk to them that same day. You may have to come back another day, or they may only want to talk to you by phone or something. So you may have to kind of find the best approach to do that. So just understand there's different ways that you can do that. All right, we already talked about Miranda. Here's the big thing. This is the important part of Miranda right here. Custody and interrogation automatically equals Miranda. If one of these is not there, I mean, you still can, but I mean, by law, you really don't have to unless both of those parts are there. Remember, Miranda doesn't apply to voluntary, unsolicited, spontaneous statements. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I was there, but I didn't do it for our. I mean, those. If they just blurt something out, that's okay. So you don't have to, read someone their rights. Miranda also doesn't. It's not required when you fingerprint somebody, or you do a handwriting exemplar, or you do a lineup, or parts of a field sobriety test, like for your DUI. There are some investigative questions that you can ask. So, I mean, you're not going to go into super detail, but you can ask some questions before you need to get into Miranda. Make sure that that the court knows that the person intelligently and knowingly waived their rights if they talk to you, and silence is not a waiver. So if you read that Miranda thing and you say, do you understand these rights? And they just stare at you, that's not a waiver of Miranda. They need to be a little bit more overt. Okay, so silence is not a waiver. One interesting thing, and then we'll be done for tonight, is something called beachheading. And this is illegal, more unconstitutional. But if an officer questions a suspect without Miranda, so you have the custody and interrogation part there, and you ask them all these questions, and you get the statement, and then you go, oh, okay, now let's go on tape. You have the right to remain silent. That's called beachheading. Does that make sense? You get your answer first, and now you're going to go on tape and Mirandize them. You can't do that. So you need, if there's custody and interrogation, you need to Mirandize them, right there, and then get your statement. You can't wait until you get all your stuff and then decide to go back. And hopefully that makes sense. But they call it beachheading, and that's something you're not supposed to do at all. All right, we talked about time and place. We talked about establishing rapport. Deception. Can we use deception in interrogations?
Yes.
Yes, we can. So we can't plant evidence per se, but limited, kind of deception is okay. And that happens a lot where you have maybe two suspects involved in a crime, and one detective is interviewing one in one room and the other has the other in there, and you're telling them, hey, we already interviewed your counterpart there, and he said you're the one that shot him. And that person never said that. So we can use some deception, but we have to be careful. We are limited, but we can use some type of deception. But we do want to be professional. And if you use deception, do you need to note that in your report? Yes, make sure if you do that, don't hide it, because it's going to come up later on. So make sure that you put in your report that you did use whatever deception that you used, or you told the suspect whatever you told them. We already know we can't use physical force. We can't use mental or psychological abuse. We can't shine a big light in their face for 5 hours. So just understand all of those things. Let's see. Okay. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of got through all of that. So we saw a little bit of the investigative side as well as the regular side. All right. Any questions tonight on anything that I've gone over? Everybody just wants to. All right. Before we go, don't sign off yet. I want to make sure that I take roll. So you guys understand everything? I'm impressed. This way I don't miss anybody. I think I missed somebody last time. I don't want you guys to yell at me. Okay, I think I got everybody. Okay, so this week is our last week before the online spring break, right? So I think we're week 10, so this week, and then so next Tuesday we won't have a meeting. I will send something out over the break that if you want to talk about your final report, I will be available to kind of go over, give you some hints if you want, or any helpful advice that I can. And we can jump on Zoom real quick and we can talk about it or whatever. And then remember, if you get in any writing assignments by the end of this week, so Sunday night at 11 p.m., if you've missed a few assignments and you want to get some credit for that, get them sent in or uploaded, etc. Make sure I can access them, and I will give you some points for those. So I'd like to kind of clean things up before the end of the before the break.
Professor, what if you missed a test? Or one of the quizzes?
If you, you're making me feel bad.
Only one, only this one.
So if you missed it, well, if you missed this past week's, I think it's open until tomorrow night.
No, I missed, I think 2 weeks ago.
All right. So if you missed a quiz and you want to be proactive, if you send me the information, because I won't be able, it's too hard for me to kind of go back there and figure out what's been missed. I will allow you the opportunity to make up a quiz. I won't do the discussion boards because then that just gets too out of control and I can't monitor everything effectively. But if you missed a quiz, if you send me the information, I will open up that quiz for like probably 24 to 48 hours and I'll give you the opportunity to jump back in and make it up. Is that fair?
Yes, thank you so much.
Anything else for the good of the order?
Are you going to have a Zoom meeting tomorrow?
Yes, I will be online tomorrow at 6 o'clock for office hours. So if there's anything that you need from me, then feel free to pop in because nobody does.
What about missing Revel assignments? I missed 1 week's worth.
Oh, you'll be okay.
Okay.
That system it's really tough to go back in there. It won't let me do things individually. It has to be like grouped. So it's a little cumbersome to do that. But if you only miss one, and I appreciate you asking about it, but you're totally fine. And don't forget to do them. Make sure you're doing your assignments in there. Anything else? Okay, you're done for tonight. Email me or text me or whatever if you need something.
Thank you.
Okay.